Thanks, guys. Well, for those of us who have been at the Footsteps of Jesus weekend experience, 1.5 days of Bob speaking at us is barely enough. And so we have the privilege of having another course of Bob this morning. Woohoo! And for those of you who are unable to join us, are in for a treat as well. Bob has a wealth of experience. He's been leading trips to Israel for over 30 years. He and his wife Pam lived in the old city of Jerusalem for a year when he was studying archaeology there. Bob has great experience in the whole areas of discipleship and mission, and they live it out in their own lives in really wonderful ways. And it's my privilege to welcome Bob up to bring the word to us this morning. Thanks, Bob.
Testing, yeah, there we go. It's a real joy and privilege to be with you all this morning. As David said, some of you, we've spent some quality time together already. And for the rest of you, it's great to meet you. And I'm very happy that my wife Pam is well enough to be here today. She was a little ill over the weekend, but so happy that she can be here with us as well. Just a little, David asked me if I would talk a little bit about Jesus' approach to family. And so for some of you that were here this weekend, it'll sound a little familiar, but we're going to just think about what does a Jesus-shaped family look like. So I want to introduce our family. We have 2 sons, Bobby and Luke, and they've married 2 wonderful young women. We like to tell them we like the daughters-in-law better than the sons. And we have been blessed with 6 beautiful grandchildren. This was last Easter. Here they're a little bit older. We just had a 1-year birthday we have 5 girls, and then the 6th one is a boy. So, he's going to get a lot of attention from his sisters and cousins. But we've recently moved to Colorado, which is kind of in the mountains in the U.S., and we're sharing life together more closely as an extended family there. So I don't know what comes to your mind when you think of family. Like what does that word conjure up for you? And there's lots of different shapes and sizes of family, right? And but in kind of our Western, more European type culture, we do tend to think of a nuclear family, don't we? Think of mom and dad and kids, or single parent and kids, or couple, or empty nesters. And we have all different kind of circumstances of life that create family in different shapes. But I don't know how much you've thought about Jesus' family. We think, of course, of Jesus' family when he's born, the Holy Family. And we have lots of images of Jesus' birth and Mary and Joseph and the baby and so forth. But we don't, when we read the Gospels, we don't hear that much about Jesus' family. So it's easy for us to kind of skip over that and just think about Jesus, the individual, doing all the amazing things he did. But the truth is that the base of Jesus' life and ministry was really family. And so we're going to explore what Jesus' family was like and how Jesus really redefined the family. We all know, of course, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Today, Bethlehem is kind of a modern city. It's in the West Bank. It's a Palestinian city. And right in the heart is the ancient Church of the Nativity, a 1,600-year-old church that marks the site of Jesus' birth, and it's quite fascinating to visit. But we know that although Jesus was born in Bethlehem, he grew up in Nazareth, up in the north part of Israel. And Nazareth is also today kind of a good-sized city, 80,000 people or so. But in the time of Jesus, it was a pretty small village, pretty small, conservative Jewish village, maybe 1,000 people at the most, something like that, surrounded by farmland and so forth. And this is where Jesus spent almost his entire life. Probably about 27 of his 30-some years was in this little village. And Mark tells us just a couple interesting things about Jesus' family that he grew up in. First of all, we know Mary, of course, is his mother. We know Joseph is his adopted father. But we sometimes don't realize he had 4 brothers that are named by Mark: James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. And James eventually becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And his brother Judas wrote the little letter in the New Testament called Jude. So those brothers really had a significant role. And they're also sisters. Unfortunately, they're not named for us. And we don't even know exactly how many. We know at least 2 because it's plural, but it could have been more. So Mary and Joseph and Jesus' 6 brothers and sisters, at least, maybe more. And when we think about family, this is kind of what we think about, isn't it? Mom, dad, and kids. And when we think about a home, in our culture, we tend to think of a single family dwelling, meaning a home or an apartment where a nuclear family lives by themselves. Now, maybe some of you come from a different cultural background, and that isn't your assumption. But I think for me, that most of my life, that's been kind of my assumption, that this is what a family is like, and this is where families live. They live nuclear families alone in single-family homes. But of course, that's not the way people lived in biblical times. And even today, around most of the world, that's not the way most people live or even think of family. In Jesus' time, the way people thought of family primarily was an extended family. And there's a word in the New Testament, oikos, that Greek word oikos, that really means an extended family and an extended family home. And this is the way everyone in Jesus' time lived, unless they were in desperate circumstances. Everyone lived in an extended family. And their houses looked remarkably consistent and similar. They were a series of rooms. You see these little rooms here? And they surround an open-air courtyard, and the outer door of the house enters into that courtyard. And all the windows and doors face inward. The outer walls don't have any windows or doors generally. And that means that when you kind of shut and bar this outer door, you have almost like a little mini fortress for your family. And this is the way people live. Multiple nuclear families living in those different rooms. And they shared life together, but they also shared a family business together. The oikos was always built around a common family business that everybody participated in. It could be a fishing family, could be a potter's family, it could be a shepherding family, it could be a weaver family. But that was how the family functioned. So this Greek word oikos means an extended family and their home. And this is where parents and grandparents, uncles and aunts, brothers, sisters, and cousins lived, usually at least 3 generations, but also non-blood relations as well. Friends, employees, slaves were also considered part of this oikos. And there's 2 reasons that everyone who possibly could lived in an oikos. And the first was protection, because they couldn't call. In Australia, do you have something like 911? 000. It's good for us to know in case an emergency comes up. Pam, 000. Remember that. So they didn't have 000. They didn't have police cars patrolling their neighborhood. And if it's just mom and dad and kids and bandits attack your family, you're in trouble. But if you have a big family, you can protect yourself. Second reason was provision. Like I said, the family is built around a family business. And if it's just mom and dad and kids, and mom and dad get sick at harvest time, you're going to starve, right? But if you have a big family, you can have a successful, productive family business. And so Jesus had a mother and father, he had brothers and sisters, but he also was part of a wider oikos. And the gospel writers don't bother to tell us that because they just assume we would understand that. But it's easy for us to miss in our culture, isn't it? Now, there's something else Mark tells us about Jesus' family, and that is that they were we read the word carpenter. Isn't this the carpenter? And so we think of Jesus in a wood shop, right? Cutting wood, working on wood. The Greek word actually is tekton, which is best translated builder. And they built lots of things. They built houses, they built roads, they built bridges. But 95% of the building material was stone. So really, it's better to think of Jesus as a stonemason, somebody who builds primarily with stone. And so this was the family business. This is what their oikos was built around. And there happened to be a building boom going on in the big city just near to Nazareth. That's probably why Joseph and his family actually moved to Nazareth, was to be a part of this kind of building boom. We also pick up about Jesus' family that they were a very devout, observant Jewish family. They were Sabbath observers. They were law observant. They went to the synagogue on Saturday to worship with their community. This is what a synagogue looked like at the time of Jesus. It has kind of these pillars that held up a higher central roof to let light into the middle. It had step seating around the perimeter, and there was a place where the rabbi sat to teach. There were the scrolls. This was the synagogue, and this was part of Jesus' rhythm. Luke tells us that on his whole life, Jesus, as was his custom, would gather on the Sabbath in the synagogue. We're also told by Luke that Jesus' family was so devout that every year they would make the 5-day journey from Nazareth down to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. This is what Jerusalem looks like today, looking from the Mount of Olives over Jerusalem. And this is the Temple Mount complex as it looked at the time of Jesus. And so every year, this was part of the rhythm of their family, was to go to the holy city and to participate in this great festival that recalled how God redeemed his people through the blood of the Lamb. So I'm just giving you a little bit of a texture, a little feel for the family that Jesus grew up in. Now, let's kind of look at what happens when Jesus begins his ministry. So for the first couple years of Jesus' life, they had fled to Egypt to avoid Herod's murderous plan. They returned to Nazareth, maybe when Jesus was 2 or 3. And then for 27, 28 years, Jesus was there working as a builder, working as a stonemason, part of his nuclear family, but also part of an extended family. But now Luke tells us that at the age of 30, Jesus is about to embark on this amazing new phase of his life where he is going to bring the good news of the kingdom to the world. And so we know that Jesus began by being baptized by his cousin John. This is the place of Jesus' baptism. We visit that on our trips. And then he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days of fasting, and then kind of a major showdown with the devil, if you remember those 3 temptations. That happened in this desert area right near to his baptism site, Wadi Kelt it's called. And then the gospel writers tell us, after all this, Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and a report about him went through all the surrounding country, and he taught in their synagogues, being glorified by all. So Jesus now is launching into his public ministry. But Luke tells us that Jesus was ultimately heading back to Nazareth, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? Here's the geography. Jesus was baptized in the southern end of the Jordan River, led into the nearby desert wilderness for his temptation. But then he returns and he stops at these different towns and cities along the way to teach in their synagogues. But ultimately, his destination is Nazareth. That's where he's heading. And of course, it's because it's his home, right? It's his family. Jesus is going back to his family. In that culture, the highest cultural value was to bring honor to your family. And it was kind of a big deal that Jesus, at 30, was leaving his oikos, but you see, he's actually coming back to it. And I think Jesus was planning and hoping that his oikos in Nazareth would become the base of his mission, that it was from there that he would go out and bring the good news to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, when we visit Nazareth today, right in the heart of the modern city, is where the ancient village of Nazareth was. And there is a great cathedral there, the Church of the Annunciation, a very beautiful modern church. But underneath that church, there are the remains of other ancient churches, which were built over ultimately a first century Jewish home, which is identified quite reliably as the home that Mary, the mother of Jesus, grew up in. This was Mary's oikos. This is where she lived. But when Mary was betrothed to Joseph and then they were married and Jesus was born, that meant that Mary she was leaving her oikos, her extended family, and she was joining Joseph's extended family. And what's fascinating and what almost nobody knows, everybody visits the Church of the Annunciation, but almost no one knows that right across the street in a little convent called the Sisters of Nazareth Convent, underneath that convent, there is also a series of ancient churches that were built over a first century Jewish house, and we have very reliable evidence pointing to this as the house of Joseph's oikos. And this is where Mary would have left her oikos, joined Joseph's oikos, and this is where she and Joseph would have raised Jesus and his brothers and sisters. And this remain that you see here is kind of a doorway that's cut into the stone hillside to give access to one of the rooms of that house. But it would have been a multi-roomed oikos, extended family house. So it's amazing to think that this doorway was used by Jesus probably every day for 27 years, right? It's kind of like, wow. And it just gives us that picture of, Jesus' life growing up. So when Jesus comes back to Nazareth, he's coming back to his oikos. He's coming back to his family. Now what's fascinating is underneath this first century house, they also discovered a rolling stone tomb, which is very beautiful. You don't expect to find that fancy a tomb in a small village like this. But of course, this was a family of builders. So they had the skills to build a really beautiful tomb under their house. And I can't say for sure, but I think this tomb is probably the tomb of Joseph, who had died sometime after Jesus was 12, and that it was actually built by Jesus and his brothers and his cousins, which is amazing. If that's true, we're looking at the actual craftsmanship of Jesus himself, Jesus the builder. But of course, Jesus now has entered a new season, right? He's entered this season of his public ministry. And so he's coming back to his oikos, and it says, as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Now, of course, he didn't go alone. As modern individualists, we think of Jesus, the modern individual, going to the synagogue. But no, he would go with his oikos, right? And we have not found the synagogue in Nazareth because it's a modern city. It's very hard to excavate because people are living over the ancient sites. But in other places, we found these first century synagogues like this one in Magdala. And so even though Jesus wasn't trained officially as a rabbi, he was recognized as a rabbi because he spoke with authority and he backed that up with acts of power. And so they asked Jesus to teach, and it says the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written. Now, in the synagogues, we find these scroll tables, and that's where you would lay the scroll down, and then you would unroll it until you found the correct passage. So that's what Jesus is doing there. And then he begins to read from what we call Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This is an amazing passage because the Jews for centuries have been oppressed by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks. Now it's the Romans, and they've been waiting for the Messiah to come and liberate them from all this oppression. And so everybody's wondering, what is Jesus going to say? It says he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant. The attendant would have put it back in the special cabinet where they keep the scrolls. And then it says then he sat down. And there was a special seat in the synagogue called the Moses seat, and that's where the rabbi sat down to teach. We tend to stand up like I am. They tended to sit down. So Jesus sits down on the Moses seat, and everyone is waiting. What is he going to say? And then Jesus says, today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Today. Like, they must have been amazed. Are you serious, Jesus? Today? This is it? The Messiah is coming? The kingdom is coming? And they imagined that meant that the Messiah would destroy the Gentiles who had oppressed them and liberate them as God's people. But Jesus went on to point out the ways that God had blessed Gentiles in the Old Testament. And his point was that this new kingdom that was coming, that the Messiah was bringing, was not just for the Jewish people, it was for everyone. But they were enraged by that idea. How dare Jesus suggest that the Gentiles get to be a part of this? And it says, when they heard these things, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath, and they rose up and drove him out of the town and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so they could throw him down the cliff. This is the traditional Mount Precipice. We don't know exactly where this event took place, but it's a good place for us to picture it. And really what's happening is they're going to stone Jesus to death. That's really what's happening in this story. But the strange thing is, we don't hear anything from Jesus' oikos. Remember, Jesus isn't there by himself. He's there with his oikos. Do you remember the two purposes of oikos? Protection and provision. Why aren't they protecting him, right? His brothers are stonemasons. These are tough guys. Why aren't they protecting? Why isn't Mary saying, don't you dare hurt my son? None of that. And, Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. Guess what that Greek word is for household? Oikos. Yeah, even his own oikos didn't stand with him. They didn't embrace his vision of the kingdom. John says it this way, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. This must have been such a painful moment in Jesus' life. But he passed through their midst some miraculous way, and he went down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee. Now, he had met some guys at the time of his baptism who lived in Capernaum. James, John, Andrew, and Simon. Actually, not James. John, Andrew, and Simon. And he knew that they lived in Capernaum. And so Jesus was really going down from Nazareth to see if maybe these guys would be more receptive and more open. He didn't find any openness from his hometown or even his family. So he comes down to this beautiful lake. We call it the Sea of Galilee, and it's such a beautiful pastoral place. We stay right on the shore of the lake and swim every day when we're there on our trips. And that's where Capernaum sits, is right on that north shore of the lake. And unlike Nazareth, this is a place that's been uninhabited since ancient times, so the archaeologists have been able to excavate it quite extensively. And they found this beautiful synagogue, and this is where Jesus taught, and he liberated the oppressed in this place. He spoke with authority, and people were amazed. But then, at the end of the synagogue service, it says he arose, left the synagogue, and entered Simon's house. So Simon was inviting Jesus into his oikos. And in Capernaum, they've excavated extensively, and they found many, many, many of these extended family homes. And that's what we're looking at here. You can kind of make out some features. There's the outer door that opens into the courtyard. This is the courtyard where they did the cooking and shared life together. There's multiple rooms around this courtyard that all connect to it. So this is a classic extended family home. Now, one of the homes in Capernaum was different from all the rest because the main room had been plastered, the walls and the floor. And the pottery that they found in there showed that right after the time of Jesus, it underwent a change. It wasn't a place just where people lived, but it was a place where people gathered. And they found some inscriptions in there that identify it as the house of Peter and the place where Jesus was now being worshiped. And so amazingly, we can identify the actual house that Simon is inviting Jesus into. Here's, we can see the threshold of the doorway is right here. This is part of the courtyard. There's actually 7 rooms that surround this courtyard, and this is the main, largest room of that house. Here's a nice, accurate reconstruction of the house. Again, here's the outer doorway that leads into the courtyard. Here's the 7 rooms that all connect to that. They even had a little animal pen. And of course, they're a fishing family. And look, they're right on the waterfront of the lake. So it's the biggest house found in Capernaum on the best spot where the best fishing was. So pretty nice setup for a fishing family, right? So Jesus entered into that house, and it says that Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a high fever. And so they appealed to him on her behalf, and he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. And immediately she rose and began to serve him. So it was a wonderful moment. They invited Jesus into your home. You didn't just invite anyone into your oikos. In an honor-shame culture, you only invite people in that are going to bring honor to your family. And Jesus, of course, as a now newly famous rabbi, he's going to bring honor to their family. So they were so pleased. He had healed the mother-in-law. Wow, what an amazing miracle and blessing. And now they're sharing food together. Jesus is probably telling them parables. I mean, it was wonderful. But Jesus is about to do something that is going to shock everyone because it's so countercultural. It says, when the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands on every one of them and healed them. And demons also came out of many, crying, "You are the Son of God." But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak because they knew that he was the Christ. Now, you see, this was shocking. Jesus has opened the door of Simon's oikos, and he's invited everyone in. And you didn't invite in people of questionable moral character or a lower social standing. And people who were sick or injured were thought of as kind of cursed by God, or they must have done something bad. Certainly the demon-possessed, if you're inviting the demon-possessed people, you're pretty much inviting everyone, right? And that's what Jesus does. He throws open the door of the oikos, and he welcomes everyone in. The oikos existed for the oikos. Just like all the windows and doors point inward, that it was an inward kind of system. But you see what Jesus is doing is he's taking their concept of family and he's turning it inside out. He's showing them a different way to be a family. He's showing them how to be a family where everyone is welcomed, even the outcasts, even those on the margins. It's interesting that when you read through the Gospels, once you've seen this thing that Jesus kind of entered into the oikos of Simon and Andrew, as you read the Gospels, you start to see it everywhere. You see how this became the base of Jesus' mission. So Mark 1 tells the same story that we've just been telling. And in Mark chapter 2, verse 1, after Jesus went out to the other towns and villages of Galilee, it says, when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. You know that word by now, right? That's the oikos. He's back in the oikos of Simon and Andrew. So it's already considered his family. This is Jesus' new family. And many were gathered together, so there was no more room, not even at the door. Once again, everybody's been invited in, and he was preaching the word to them. So again, this is the picture we have. Jesus is here, probably in the main room of the house. People are spilling out into the courtyard, and they're right up to the doorway. The house is full of people that have been welcomed in. It goes on in Mark chapter 3. Jesus goes out with his disciples. He comes back to Capernaum. Then he went home. He went back to his oikos. And the crowd gathered again, so they could not even eat. So you see, this was the rhythm. Going out, coming back, welcoming everyone into the family. Now, when his family heard it, meaning his biological family back in Nazareth, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, he's out of his mind. Like they thought he had gone crazy, right? And so when you have someone with mental illness out on the streets, what do? Well, you go try to find them and hopefully bring them home and nurse them back to health. Well, that's exactly what Jesus' mother and brothers do. They come from Nazareth down to Capernaum, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. You see, Jesus has redefined the family. He was showing them a whole new way to live as a family. Not necessarily a biological family, but a spiritual family. Not a Jesus-shaped family is not just a nuclear family, but it's an extended family where people are welcomed in. It's not just a biological family, but it's a spiritual family where we're connected by our common identity with God. And it's not a family that is inward focused. It is not a family that simply seeks to serve itself. But as Jesus said, he came to seek and save the lost. This is the mission of Jesus. And this new kind of family is turned inside out because it's meant to be a missional family. This is how Jesus lived. This is the way of Jesus. And we like to call this Jesus-shaped family a family on mission. There's different ways of thinking how your family can relate to your mission. And some people think you have to choose one or the other. Like in the Catholic Church, if you want to be fully devoted as a priest, you can't have a family, right? And we know there's something not quite biblical about that. Doesn't seem quite right. When Pam and I were married 38 years ago, we had two main priorities. We wanted to raise a healthy family where our children came to know and love and follow Jesus, but we also wanted to lead a vibrant church that was reaching the lost and making disciples and bringing the kingdom to the world. And we thought of these as two kind of different things in a way. And in some ways, they were always kind of competing with each other for our time and attention. And we thought of our mission mainly at the building of the church that we led, and we thought of our family mainly in the home that we lived in. And we almost tried to protect our family from the mission because it was a very demanding mission. And so the problem with that, though, is we were always being pulled apart is kind of how it felt. Now, some people go the other way, and they make their family, I think my clicker just died on me. They make, yeah, I think it's plugged in. No? There we go. Ashley to the rescue. Woo! Love it. Okay. Even so, I think my clicker died. Multiple things. Or it's frozen. There we go. Okay, there we go. Thank you. See if the clicker is working now. Okay. So some people go the other way, and they make their nuclear family their entire mission. This is kind of like helicopter parents, right? But we know, ultimately, even though our children are our most important mission, that our mission is bigger than just our own biological family. Well, what Jesus did was he built a family on mission, a family where the mission was integrated into the life of the family. And over the last 16 years or so, Pam and I have been on a journey of trying to intentionally allow Jesus' way of life to shape and define our way of life. And so for us, part of that has been learning a different way to be a family. Now, when we first started kind of intentionally learning the way of Jesus and understood the way Jesus did family, we were kind of regretful because our boys were just launching. They were in their late teens and early 20s, and they were heading off to college, and we kind of felt like we missed our chance to do that with our sons. But we realized that we didn't necessarily need to have our sons to do that, so we started learning how to live more as a family on mission, gathering together other disciples, building a sense of family, welcoming our neighbors and those who didn't know Jesus. And we were kind of learning this new way of life. And what was interesting is that as our sons finished college, they kind of started to orbit back into our lives. And they saw that we were living in a different way, and it was kind of appealing to them. And they started to connect more to that new way of life. And so I don't know kind of how you're thinking about your family, but I know for me and Pam, as we've decided to let Jesus' way of life shape our way of life, our family life has become so much more fruitful, so much healthier, and producing good fruit. And I mentioned that we recently moved to Colorado, and we moved along with our two sons and their families, and also our younger son's in-laws moved as well. And we built 3 houses together. You can see this is looking from our back deck, and the 2 houses that you see there are our 2 sons' homes. And we kind of built them with a common back garden, you might call it, right? We call it a yard, but here maybe you call it a garden. And the goal is to learn how to live more as an extended family on mission together. And we each still have our own houses, so there's still kind of a little bit of individualism there, which is good, but we're really learning a different way to function as a family. And one of our goals is not only to support and help each other, but also to be a light into our neighborhood and into the networks of friends that we have around us. Now, this, of course, is what it looks like now because it's winter in Colorado, not like here. But what we've been doing is we've been starting to intentionally meet our neighbors and start to welcome them and invite them into our lives. And so once every 4 to 6 weeks, we have a kind of a neighbors gathering. Everybody brings food to share, so it's not like we're having to put on some big event for everyone. We're just welcoming them. Everyone brings food, and it's been so wonderful just to start to get our neighbors and to welcome them in. And we have people from all different backgrounds, all different walks of life, all different configurations of family. We've got families with kids. We have empty nesters. We have single moms. There's 2 gay couples that are part of it. And we just welcome them in and start to try to show them love and begin to build friendships with them. And our goal is to spark spiritual conversations and start to be able to share our faith with them as our trust grows together. And we often try to organize it around whatever the most recent holiday is. So in our December gathering, we had a little Christmas party, and we decorated Christmas cookies together, which was really a mess and a lot of fun. Our last one, America, we have the Super Bowl in February, so we had a Super Bowl party, and we're just learning how, as an extended family, to welcome our neighbors, build relationships with them, and start first to show them the kingdom of God, but also then to tell them about the kingdom of God. And our hope and our prayer is that some of these new friends will come to know Jesus and begin to follow him. And I know for a lot of our Christian life, we focused on trying to invite those who didn't know Jesus to come to our church building and to participate in our church services and programs. And there's nothing wrong with that. We just found that most people wanted nothing to do with that. But what we've learned is that the way of Jesus, Jesus was very involved in the synagogue. And yet he never told his disciples, hey, find lost people and try to get them to come to the synagogue. Instead, what Jesus did was he opened up a home and a family, and that's where he welcomed in the broken and the hurting, the outcast, and that's where he built this new kind of family. And so I know for me and Pam, this has been so life-giving. It's not been easy. We've had to change our way of life. We've been stretched in different ways. Pam's more of an introvert. I'm more of an extrovert. So for Pam especially, opening up her home was a challenge. But we learned to live in healthy rhythms. So that gave Pam the confidence that workaholic Bob wasn't going to have people over every day of the week. But we have healthy rhythms. And so just sharing with you the blessing and the joy of learning the way of Jesus, particularly when it comes to family. Now, we know that we are the exception to the rule because we're doing this primarily with our biological family. And that's not usually the way it works. Didn't work that way for Jesus. Actually, the Apostle Paul had a similar situation. So for most of us, it's not going to necessarily be with our biological family. It's going to be a spiritual family. If we can, of course, we'd love our biological family to be at the heart of that. So I want to encourage you, remember, Jesus was a single man, not married, no wife, no children, and his own biological family didn't stand with him, and yet he built the most amazing family ever in the history of the world. So whatever your situation in life, Jesus is still calling you, he's inviting you to follow him, to follow his way, and to discover the joy, the blessing, and the fruitfulness of living as a family on mission, of letting Jesus' way shape your own sense and practice of family. So let's just pause for a moment and let's just open our hearts and minds and invite the Holy Spirit to come and just highlight to us whatever it is that Jesus is saying to us about this. Jesus, we thank you that your yoke is easy and your burden is light. And so we thank you that you're inviting us into a way of life that is life-giving, that is fruit-producing. But we also know, Jesus, that you said that we would have to take up our cross in order to follow you. And so, Lord, whatever inside of us is resisting your way, we just come to the cross and ask you to just put that old self to death, put that resistant part of us to death, so that we can come alive more fully in the power of your resurrection, and that we can learn one step of faith at a time what it means to follow you, what it means especially in our family life to learn to build and to function as an extended spiritual family that's living on mission together. So thanks, Jesus, that you're here to show us the way. We just submit to you, we yield to you, and we seek to follow you. And in your name we pray. Amen.
Excellent.